Hang on, I need to click. There we go.
Well, good afternoon, Carol. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon for afternoon tea.
Lovely to be here.
So my first question to you is, what was your childhood like?
Possibly very different from a lot of people's, because I'm quite old, and so many years ago, I think childhood probably was a bit different. I was brought up in the East End of London. My father was a GP there, and it was before the health service was as it is now, and so things were very different. I remember in his surgery, you know, people would turn up and then he'd be there till they were all seen. And if there were 40 people, he'd see 40 people. And then he'd do house calls, and then he'd repeat it all in the evening, and he'd be on call every night. So it was a bit of a different world. And we lived in the area we were in was then a very poor area of London. I mean, now it's really upmarket. I have no idea what houses would cost there now, but in those days it was very poor and very run down. And there were things like in one of the side streets, there was a little butcher's shop, and elderly women would sit outside the shop on wooden chairs plucking chickens in the street. You know, it's just, you tell people this nowadays, they can't actually believe it, because it's like a different world.
And did you have any siblings?
Yeah, I've got one sister. She's 8 years younger than me.
Yeah.
And so for 8 years, really, I was brought up with adults rather than children. So I think that sort of influenced things quite a bit too, because I think if you spend most of your time with adults, you probably develop a rather different approach to how you do things and what you do. But yes, my sister's, she's very different. She's very artistic. She does all kinds of creative things. She colours and restores photographs and does online art and all kinds of things. And my mother was a portrait sculptor, so there was always a lot of sort of artistic things in the house. And we used to have exhibitions as well when I was quite young, about 2 or 3 times a year. So it was quite interesting.
And obviously you went to school, and did you enjoy school?
I absolutely hated it.
I
couldn't bear school. For various reasons, I think. I mean, the first one was I wasn't really used to children. I was used to adults. And so it was different trying to talk to children who were sort of interested in children's things, which I wasn't really used to. I didn't like being told what to do, because I'd never really been told what to do. And so to go into a situation where things were structured and there was a system, I didn't really like that. Really didn't like most of the subjects at all. I mean, the only thing I liked was English. And we had a really nice English teacher who was superb, and the rest I could have done without, so I didn't go. If I could avoid it, I didn't go. And my father colluded with that, so he'd take me out for the day and he'd say, "Get down in the back of the car so nobody can see you." So I had to lie on the floor at the back of the car. We went somewhere, and you know, I don't suppose people would do that nowadays either. But if I could avoid being there, I did.
So your father then helped to get you out of school then. So what did you do instead of going?
I didn't have a lot of choice. I had 2 strategies. The first one was just refuse to go. The second one was get a sore throat. So I spent a lot of my childhood being not terribly well with sore throats. You know, whether they were genuine or whether it was all psychosomatic, I have no idea. But I quite often had a good reason not to go.
Yeah. So was that your major problem at school then? Was basically not being there?
It wasn't for me. And I remember once I'd actually been there quite a lot, and the teacher asked me to come and stand in front of the class and faced all the other kids, and she said, "Carol, class, Carol has been here every day this term." Great. So no, it wasn't really a problem for me, but obviously it could have been, potentially it could have been a problem educationally. In practice it wasn't, and I did pretty well, but just not at school.
Okay. And did you go on to further education?
Yes, eventually. Because I really didn't like school, I thought, can't face doing any more of this sort of stuff. So I actually did a secretarial course because I was thinking, I had two interests really. One was archaeology and the other one was writing. So I thought maybe going to journalism, but apparently you needed to do shorthand. So I thought, well, if I do a secretarial course, I'll learn shorthand. So I did that. Didn't like that either. So then I went back and did a degree in sociology because that was kind of the closest I could get to archaeology. I suppose I was thinking about anthropology and couldn't get in to study that. So I did sociology. So yes, did in the end. I did reasonably well. I don't have a problem academically. I just have a problem with institutions.
So you left further education. So what did you do then?
Well, I'd got married while I was in my last year or two of doing my degree. And my husband was working as a research chemist, and the company he was working for was moving out of London. We were still living in London. In fact, we lived with my parents for a couple of years after I got married. So his job was moving out of London. And I thought, well, probably better find something to do. And the company he was working for was moving to Luton. So I kind of did the research, and I could only see two things that Luton was notable for. One was hat making. I still couldn't bear hats. I thought, you know, can't imagine going to hat making. And the other one was Vauxhall Motors. So I contacted them. And at the time, most of Luton was Vauxhall. They had their own streets, they had shops, they had banks. I mean, it was like a little town inside town. Well, in those days, the employment situation was so different. And I contacted them and said, have you got any jobs? And they said, what would you like to do? I said, I don't know. And then I sort of vaguely remembered something like personnel management. So I said, oh, well, personnel management? So I said, okay, that's fine. So they offered me a job. And then when I got there, I found actually there wasn't really a job anyway. They kind of made it up. So I was in what was then called labour relations. It even predated industrial relations. And so we shared office space with the trade unions. And it was about the time that one of the Industrial Training Acts had been passed. So I just made up a job and went around looking at training and how it was done. And it was quite pleasant. I was only there for about a year, I think. But that was my first exposure to the world of work. And in fact, the first day was memorable. And it was one of the stories, we were talking about stories, and this was one. But my first day, I'd been asked to report to the personnel department. So no idea where that was. And it was a very long street, buildings each side of it. So I walked along, and in the end, I stopped somebody and I said, do you know where the personnel department is? And he said, oh, yeah, it's through there, pointing. So I went to where he was pointing, and it was the men's loo. So that was a good start to the world of work. Had to go better from there on.
Yeah. So what made you decide to do what you're doing today?
Well, you see, there's an assumption in that. I've never had a strategy for my life or for work. So obviously, if you do something, you have decided to do it. But I think that's very different from premeditating it, if that's meditating it as a phrase. I didn't sit down and think, what shall I do now? I've never done that. I've always kind of gone from one thing to another because something's come up and sounded interesting, and so I've done it. My last job was, I left in 1986. I was one of the directors of the Arts Council in London, and I left there, and my thought then was to get a job as a chief executive of a small organisation, maybe a charity or something like that. And it was interesting because they really wanted two things. They wanted somebody who had management experience, and they also wanted that person to have PR, marketing skills, and so on. And at that stage, I got the first, but not the second. So I kept getting interviewed and getting down to the last 2 or 3, and then not getting the job. And it's funny because now most of what I'm doing is to do with marketing and PR in one way or another. But in those days, it wasn't. So at that point, I thought, well, let's set up on my own then. So I set up a small management consultancy and training firm. It was just me, really, but I was involved with other people doing similar things. So we could do larger projects if we needed. And I did mostly organisational development work with a whole range of organisations, and a lot of corporate training, soft skills training, things like negotiating and communication skills and presenting, a mix of things like that. And that was in 1986. So I've been self-employed since then, and things have kind of gradually moved on. So we moved from London to Wales about 30 years ago. And of course, there aren't as many large corporate organisations locally as there were when I was in London. And I've always been kind of waylaid by ideas. So if something comes up, I tend to follow it. And somebody told me about a business. It was a network marketing business in health and wellbeing. And at that stage, I said, I don't really think that's the sort of thing I'd want to do. But then a few days later, I decided to get involved with it. And I've been doing that for 18 years. So mostly that involves coaching and mentoring people to build home-based businesses, usually alongside something else, either another job, a job or another business. It might be people who have retired or coming up to retirement and they want another interest. There's lots of reasons why people do things like that. I trained as an image consultant along the way and did a little bit of that. And I also, in 86, I trained in NLP, and I guess not everybody will know what that is. So it stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. And it's very much about how you achieve results. I know you know this, Karen, but obviously not everybody will. How people get good results at anything. And what it does is it enables you to take different areas of the way people function, how they think, their emotional states, their beliefs, their behaviour, the objectives that they're after, and then break it down into quite small detail so that you can help them make changes if they need to. And a lot of it's about language as well, which is obviously really important. And I trained with somebody called David Baughan, who was one of the very early developers of NLP as we know it today, and he was a superb trainer. And so I got a very systematic, structured, holistic way of looking at it, which a lot of people, I think, don't get. So a lot of my work's been based on that. And that comes into the coaching I do and the training and mentoring and so on. And then I've always written books. So it wasn't a question of getting into that, because I'll show you, these are on my website as well, but these are my first books, which I wrote when I was about 6, I think. I say wrote. I mean, a lot of it was taken from other places, rather precocious subjects. One was about winning Caxton, and the other one was about ancient Mesopotamia. But nonetheless, I've been doing things like that since I was quite a young kid. So in recent years, I've done a lot more in terms of writing. I probably do a book every year or 2. And most of my business books based on NLP. Some are children's books, educational books. One of them that I've reissued recently was this one, which I wrote many years ago. But things have changed so much, because 20 years ago, we didn't have social media, we didn't have video conferencing. The world was a different place. And I look back at what I've said about image, what do you wear if you go to a networking meeting, and all that's changed. So I updated that book. So I'm constantly doing things like that. So it wasn't a question of how did I decide to do what I'm doing. It was things cross my path and I follow them. I think that's probably the best way of describing it.
Okay.
It's a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, that's how it is.
That's okay. And has the pandemic affected your business at all?
Not particularly. I took a decision about 7 or 8 years ago to do most of my work from home. And so instead of being in my car all the time and driving around for hours on end, meeting people and doing things, I decided to do most of it from home anyway. So I still do pretty much what I did then, but a lot of it is online or by phone or whatever. So that hasn't changed. One thing has got better, and that is I used to do a lot of face-to-face networking meetings, but because we live in a small village and it's not very close to towns, it was always pretty much an hour's drive to get to something. So if you go to a networking meeting, it's a half a day. Well, now you can hop on a Zoom call and an hour later you've achieved what you would have done if it was face-to-face, but you've done it in an hour instead of 3 hours or 4 hours. So that's actually worked better. I seem to have met a lot more people and really interesting people, and done a lot more sort of personal contact after meeting them at a big meeting. So that's helped. We haven't been able to do events, obviously. In terms of the health business, we couldn't do events or trade stands or fairs or anything like that, which I would do from time to time. But that was never a huge part of what I did. The one thing I do miss doing is live training, face-to-face training, because I have done training sessions on well, sometimes Zoom, sometimes other platforms. And it's sort of okay, but it doesn't work as well. I mean, I did one training session on presentation skills, and I couldn't see the people on it because there were reasons for that. Well, doing a session on presenting when you can just see yourself and nobody else is a bit weird.
Yeah,
it was fine, but you don't get the interaction.
No.
Obviously, you get it if it's a live face-to-face event. But otherwise, there's not been, and writing really, whether it's a pandemic or not, doesn't affect your ability to sit at a keyboard.
No. Okay. And looking back over your life, is there anything that you would have changed? Knowing what you know now.
I've always had a reasonably healthy life, but I think I would have probably taken even more care, perhaps over the last 30 years. And also thinking back to the children, because we didn't have the same concepts. I mean, I'll give you an example. This is actually nothing to do with changing things, but my father was a GP. So what did we get to play with? Mercury. Love mercury, but it's not the healthiest of things. We were taken to shoe shops, and you put your feet in little machines and pressed a button, and it x-rayed your feet so you could see the bones of your feet through your shoes. So it's a bit bizarre. So I think perhaps if I knew things that we know now about some aspects of health, gut bacteria, blue light, why exercise is important. We did quite a reasonable amount of exercise, but things like that. And obviously things like ecology. I mean, one of my children's books is about ecology, but we never really paid attention to things like that. I mean, we had plastic stuff years ago, but of course nobody realised it was an issue. And in fact, when I wrote that book, that was only 6-7 years ago, we weren't really particularly aware of things like microplastics.
No.
So it changes so quickly. So I think, probably a bit of a greater awareness of some of the things that go on around us. I don't think I've particularly changed other things. And who knows, if you could go back and live a different life, it might be better. It might be worse. But I think a lot of it is what you make it. What would be wonderful, and I'm not the only person to say this, is if you could relive your younger years with the experience of your older ones.
Yeah.
That would be superb. But as far as we know, we can't do that.
That's
But that would be wonderful.
So how can anybody help you listening to the broadcast? And
Yeah.
if they need help off you, how can they get in touch with you?
Okay. So what would be really nice is if people could have a look at my books, have a look at my website, and if any of them are of interest, if they could mention them to anybody they think might be interested in them, that would be great. I'm always looking for online bookshops that might be interested in stocking some of my books. So if anybody knows of either a small or a large online bookshop, or somebody who has a web shop and books might fit within it, obviously be happy to talk to them about that. So that's the first thing. I'm also always quite keen to do more podcasts and radio shows. I usually talk about either writing or about NLP. So there's other things as well, but those are the two things to talk about most commonly. So if anybody knows about podcasts or radio shows that might be interested, that would be great. The third thing is that if you happen to know anybody who is coming up to retirement or has retired and either needs some extra income or would like a new hobby, again, always happy to talk to them. And the last thing, which would be really helpful, is if you could check me out on LinkedIn and leave some comments on some of my posts, that would be wonderful. I've been doing a series which I think is going to turn into another book. And it's about business, so it's tips about business. I do them twice a week. I do one on Monday and one on Friday. Mm-hmm. And they're all conversations between me and inanimate objects around the house. And the inanimate objects are talking about business, so they're meant to be quite humorous. So if anybody would like to leave some messages about those, that would be great. If anybody wants to get in touch, then the simplest thing is to email me. And it's a really simple email. It's just carolharris.uk. There isn't a co in it, so it's just carolharris.uk. And sorry, not just the email is info@carolharris.uk, and my website is carolharris.uk. So if you want to look at the books, go to the website and click on books. And if you need help with anything, always happy to have a chat. And if I can help in any way, then I'd be pleased to do that. So do get in touch if you'd like to do so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Have you got any questions, Mandy?
Yeah, so here I am. Yes, Carol, I have a question. You've written so many books now, so different types of books. Was your father not disappointed because you didn't go his way of going into being a doctor or something, that you decided to write books instead of going in his footsteps?
Well, first of all, I only started publishing books 20 years ago. So in fact, he didn't see most of them. He did see one or two of them. In fact, some of my books are on the cabinets behind me. You can see some of them. The question of going into medicine never came up, ever. I know with a lot of families, it's traditional for people to do what their parents do, what their grandparents do, and particularly in medicine. I think that happens quite often. But it was never mentioned. What my father did do was to encourage me to do things and to achieve things. And so I suppose that was a bit ingrained from when I was a kid. I think he rather overdid it, so I kind of assumed that I could do anything I chose to. And most people can do quite a lot of things, but not everything. But no, the question of doing medicine never arose. I wouldn't have wanted to do it, but it never really came up.
Okay, thank you.
It was an interesting question, thank you. But I came across a new term. Somebody I've connected with on LinkedIn sent me a message saying, "Hello, fellow multi-potentialite," and I thought, she's made that up. So I looked it up and she hadn't. And it means somebody who does a lot of things, has a lot of interests, or is good at a lot of things. And if you have a lot of interests, it can be quite hard for people to understand what it is you do, because a lot of people just do one thing or a couple of things, and it's very easy to describe, and it's very easy to run a business if there's one thing that you do. when you do several things, have to work a lot harder at it to kind of explain to people and to communicate effectively. But it does make life interesting.
Mm. Mm. Well, Carol, thank you very much for joining me for afternoon tea today.
That's been great. Thanks, Carol. Lovely to see you again. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you.